Before colonialism fully gripped southern Africa, a storm of conflict tore through its lands. Villages vanished, kingdoms were born, and millions were displaced. From the rolling grasslands of KwaZulu-Natal to the highlands of Lesotho and beyond, entire populations were swept up in a chain reaction of war, migration, famine, and state building. This was the era known as the Mfecane, a word that still stirs debate, pride, sorrow, and controversy across the region today. The term Mfecane, a Zulu word meaning the crushing or the scattering, refers to a period roughly between 1815 and 1840, during which southern Africa experienced a massive wave of upheaval. It is also known in Sesotho as Mfecane and in Setswana as Mfecane, meaning forced migration or the crushing. Although the names differ, they all point to the same set of cascading disruptions that tore through the region like a wildfire. These were not just wars of conquest, but wars of survival. What began as a local shift in power dynamics escalated into one of the most profound demographic and political transformations in African history. Geographically, the Mfecane was not confined to one small pocket of land. It covered a massive swath of southern Africa, including modern-day South Africa, Lesotho, Eswatini, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and parts of Malawi and Tanzania. Waves of displaced people moved north, east, and west, sometimes in search of safety, sometimes to conquer, and often to start anew. Entire ethnic groups splintered or merged. New kingdoms emerged where only clans had once stood. The movement of people across such vast distances was so dramatic that it permanently altered the political map of the region. Traditionally, the Mfecane has been attributed to the meteoric rise of one man, Shaka Zulu. His military reforms, aggressive expansionist policies, and desire to consolidate power within the Zulu kingdom are often seen as the initial spark that set the region ablaze. And indeed, Shaka's leadership was transformative. He took a small clan and turned it into a formidable military state, introducing new tactics, instilling discipline, and crushing opposition. His armies did not merely fight, they restructured the societies they encountered. Many of the smaller chiefdoms he attacked or absorbed were destabilized, triggering flight and resistance that rippled outward. But as historians have pointed out, especially in recent decades, the story is far more complex than simply blaming it all on the Zulu. Some scholars, such as Julian Cobbing, argued that the Mfecane narrative was later manipulated by colonial and apartheid governments to justify land seizures and the myth of an empty land. According to this theory, Europeans painted a picture of Africans destroying one another so completely that the interior of southern Africa was supposedly depopulated, making it ripe for colonization. In truth, the period's violence was compounded by European slave raiding, trade disruptions, and border pressures. Portuguese slave traders in Mozambique, Dutch and British settlers along the Cape frontier, and missionary incursions all played a role in destabilizing local politics and economies. The Mfecane, then, was not just the result of internal African dynamics, it was also a product of growing contact, often violent and exploitative, with the outside world. The causes were layered: environmental pressures, increased competition for trade, the introduction of European firearms, and the breakdown of traditional alliances and food systems. In short, it was a perfect storm. Amid this storm rose towering figures who would reshape southern Africa forever. Milicazi, once a general under Shaka, would break away and lead his followers north to form the Ndebele kingdom in present-day Zimbabwe. Moshoeshoe I, known for his wisdom and diplomacy, would gather his people in the mountain fortress of Thaba Bosui and lay the foundations for what is now Lesotho. Zwangendaba, another leader fleeing southward conflict, would march his people over 1,000 miles northward, establishing the Ngoni identity in regions of Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania. Each of these leaders was a product of the chaos and a response to it. The Mfecane, then, is not a single story. It is many stories overlapping, colliding, and reshaping each other. It is a story of displacement and statecraft, of violence and vision, of grief and rebirth. It challenges simple narratives. It reminds us that African history is not a static backdrop for European conquest, but a living, breathing epic filled with movement, innovation, and resilience. As we step into this period together, we'll follow the migrations, examine the motivations, and lift the veil on the myths. This is the story of the Mfecane, how war and migration reshaped a continent before the colonizers ever drew their maps. To understand the firestorm of violence and migration that came to be known as the Mfecane, we must begin before the first spear was thrown, before Shaka's rise, and before the kingdoms we now associate with Southern Africa had taken shape. At the dawn of the 19th century, Southern Africa was a landscape of many peoples, languages, and allegiances. The region was home to an intricate mosaic of clans and chiefdoms. Ngoni-speaking peoples along the eastern coast, Sotho and Swana speakers in the interior highlands, and other communities like the Ndebele and Mfecane along the southeastern frontier. These societies were often organized around kinship ties, age sets, and clan-based rule, each with its own territory and traditions. But beneath this diversity was a growing tension. Politically, the region was fragmented, with dozens of small polities coexisting, sometimes peacefully, but often in competition. These communities were not static. They were in constant negotiation with one another over land, water, cattle, and trade. Chiefs sought to assert dominance, expand their influence, or protect their people from rivals. These rivalries simmered for decades, but by the early 1800s, they began to boil over. The pressures weren't just political, they were deeply environmental and economic as well. Southern Africa in the late 18th and early 19th centuries faced a series of climatic challenges. Prolonged droughts in the interior, especially in the high-veld and low-veld regions, reduced the availability of fertile grazing land. This was a crisis in societies where cattle were not only central to the economy, but symbolic of wealth, social status, and spiritual connection. As pasture land diminished and water sources dried up, competition for natural resources intensified. Communities once separated by generous buffers of unclaimed land now found themselves eyeing the same scarce rivers and grasslands. Overpopulation in some regions, especially in fertile river valleys, exacerbated these tensions, making existing landholding arrangements untenable. The resulting food insecurity was devastating. Famine was not unfamiliar to the people of the region, but its frequency and severity during this period were alarming. Starving communities grew desperate, raiding neighbors for cattle and grain, further disrupting social order. These cycles of raid and counter-raid gradually normalized the use of violence as a tool of survival. The old systems of diplomacy and alliance building could no longer absorb the pressures. And in this volatile mix, militarization began to accelerate. One of the most significant factors contributing to the rise of conflict was the reorganization of power among larger chiefdoms, especially along the southeastern coast. The Ndebele, led by the ambitious chief Zwangendaba, and the Mfecane, under the leadership of Didnt, emerged as two major centers of power. These groups began to absorb or dominate smaller clans, often using both diplomacy and force. This shift toward centralization marked the beginning of the military state model that would later be perfected by the Zulu under Shaka. Warfare in the region began to evolve, not just in terms of frequency, but in strategy, structure, and scale.
This shift was also influenced by growing external pressures, particularly from the Portuguese in the east. The Portuguese slave trade, especially active in Mozambique, had started to penetrate the interior. Local chiefs near the coast were drawn into slaving economies, sometimes raiding their inland neighbors to supply captives for trade. This fostered instability, incentivized violence, and disrupted long-standing relationships between communities. Some groups began arming themselves in response, not just with spears, but increasingly with European firearms, which were becoming more accessible through trade networks. The introduction of these weapons, though limited at first, began to escalate the lethality of local conflicts. While not every chiefdom had guns, the fear of being outgunned pushed others to militarize rapidly. It became a dangerous arms race in a region already teetering on the edge. This was compounded by another development, the rise of cattle raiding as a primary strategy for survival and dominance. Raids were no longer small-scale or seasonal. They became organized military campaigns aimed at completely subjecting weaker neighbors, seizing their herds, and incorporating their populations, sometimes forcibly, into stronger groups. The idea of expansion as a survival tactic took root. These conditions birthed what historians call a crisis of transformation. The traditional kin-based systems of governance began to give way to centralized militarized states. Leaders who could innovate, discipline, and protect their followers rose to prominence. Authority became increasingly tied to military success and control over people, not just lineage. Loyalty shifted from clan to commander, from ancestry to army. This era also witnessed the rise of new ideologies of leadership. Chiefs were no longer just spiritual figures or custodians of custom. They were warlords, administrators, and tacticians. Charisma, cunning, and coercion became the traits most valued in leadership. Those who could not adapt to this new order were absorbed, annihilated, or displaced. Those who could adapt, like Dingiswayo of the Mfecane and later Shaka of the Zulu, would reshape the destiny of entire regions. In essence, the Mfecane did not erupt in a vacuum. It was seated in a landscape under severe ecological stress, populated by communities already on edge and manipulated by external trade dynamics. The political map was fraying, the economic systems were strained, and social structures were bending under pressure. Violence was no longer a last resort. It was becoming a method of governance. The region was a tinderbox. It only needed a spark. That spark would come in the form of Shaka, an ambitious warrior whose genius and brutality would ignite a wildfire of upheaval. But before we examine his rise, it's crucial to remember that the world he entered was already trembling. The Mfecane was not simply caused by one man or one kingdom. It was the product of multiple converging crises that had been building for decades. The storm had been gathering. Shaka simply rode the lightning. In the violent reshaping of southern Africa during the early 19th century, no name looms larger than Shaka Zulu. Revered by some as a military genius and feared by others as a ruthless conqueror, Shaka stands at the center of the Mfecane, a man whose innovations and ambitions turned a minor chieftaincy into an empire and triggered a wave of transformation that echoed far beyond his borders. But Shaka did not rise in a vacuum. His ascent was forged in hardship, fostered by mentors, and catalyzed by a region already brimming with conflict. Shaka was born around 1787 to the Ngoni clan, the product of an unwed union between Nandi, a strong-willed woman of the Ngoni, and Zwangendaba, a Zulu chief. His early years were marked by rejection and exile, a formative trauma that shaped his character. Shunned by his father's people and ridiculed by his mother's clan, Shaka was raised under the Mfecane Confederacy, where he came under the protection and influence of the visionary leader Dingiswayo. It was under Dingiswayo's rule that Shaka learned the principles of leadership, diplomacy, and warfare. Mswaya himself was an innovator who had already begun centralizing power among the Muthetwa and experimenting with military discipline. But where Mswaya laid the foundations, Shaka would build the fortress. When Mswaya was captured and killed by Zwaide, the powerful chief of the Ndwandwe, the fragile balance of power in the region collapsed. Seizing the moment, Shaka rallied the Zulu and Muthetwe remnants, assumed leadership, and launched a military campaign that would change the course of Southern African history. In the space of just a few years, Shaka turned the Zulu kingdom from a minor clan into a dominant regional force through a relentless series of wars, forced alliances, and strategic genius. What made Shaka's approach revolutionary was not merely his aggression, but his reform of warfare itself. Prior to Shaka, most battles in the region were relatively small-scale and symbolic, often involving minimal bloodshed and resolving disputes without widespread destruction. Shaka broke with this tradition. He transformed the Zulu army into a professional fighting force, organized in age-based regiments called amabuto. These regiments trained full-time, lived in military kraals, and operated with brutal discipline. Military service became not just a duty, but a lifestyle, woven into the very identity of the Zulu male. Shaka also re-engineered the tools of war. He replaced the traditional long-throwing spear, assegai, with a short stabbing spear, the eye-claw, designed for close combat. This change forced his warriors to engage at close quarters, intensifying the violence and decisiveness of battles. Shields were reinforced, battle drills standardized, and warriors taught to march long distances barefoot, in silence, and unity. Perhaps most famously, Shaka introduced the buffalo horn formation, a tactical innovation that became the cornerstone of Zulu battlefield success. The army was divided into three components: the chest, the horns, which surrounded the enemy, and the loins, which were reserve forces used to pursue the enemy. This strategy enabled Zulu forces to trap and annihilate enemies with overwhelming force and coordination. It was not just effective, it was psychologically devastating. Armed with these innovations, Shaka unleashed a campaign of consolidation and conquest. One by one, neighboring clans and chiefdoms were either absorbed into the Zulu kingdom or destroyed. Those who surrendered were incorporated into the Zulu social structure. Those who resisted were slaughtered or displaced. In a region already struggling with drought and resource scarcity, Shaka's aggressive expansion created a massive wave of forced migrations, setting off the chain reaction now known as the Mfecane. One of Shaka's most formidable opponents was Zwaide of the Ndwandwe, who had once overpowered Mswaya. The rivalry between the two leaders culminated in a decisive showdown. In a series of fierce battles, including the pivotal Battle of Mlathuza River around 1919, Shaka defeated Zwaide's forces, driving the Ndwandwe northward. The defeat of Zwaide marked a turning point. It eliminated the only real rival power in Southeast Africa and gave Shaka undisputed control over the Zulu heartland. But it also unleashed unintended consequences. As Zwaide's defeated warriors fled north, they didn't simply disappear. Many regrouped, reorganized, and became new agents of conquest in distant lands. The defeated did not disappear, they became conquerors elsewhere. This was the beginning of the Mfecane's second act, the domino effect of displacement. Shaka's reign was as much about state building as it was about conquest. He reorganized the Zulu kingdom into a centralized, militarized state. Tribute systems were established, roads and supply routes were managed. Intelligence gathering became systematic. Surveillance of rival chiefs and suspected rebels was common. Loyalty was rewarded with power. Betrayal was punished with ruthless efficiency. Shaka's control extended beyond the battlefield into every facet of government, culture, and daily life. Yet his regime was also marked by paranoia and brutality. Shaka's methods were not simply about efficiency, they were often terroristic. Public executions, forced labor, and purges of perceived traitors kept both subjects and allies in constant fear. Some historians believe that this climate of fear eventually led to his downfall. By the late 1820s, cracks began to appear in the Zulu Empire. Drought and famine returned. Popular support waned under the burden of endless warfare. Internal dissent grew among his generals and family. In 1828, Shaka was assassinated by his half-brothers, Ngoni and Mfecane, with the help of a trusted servant. His reign ended abruptly, but the impact of his rule endured. The militarization, displacements, and political transformations he unleashed could not be undone. Even after his death, the Mfecane continued, fueled by the leaders and armies that Shaka's wars had scattered across the subcontinent. Many of the commanders who fled his dominance, men like Mzilikazi, Zwangendaba, and Soshangane, would go on to found powerful kingdoms of their own in faraway lands. In this way, Shaka's legacy extended far beyond the borders of KwaZulu-Natal. His influence stretched into present-day Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique. The empire he built by the spear had lit a fire that would rage across southern Africa for years to come. But Shaka's story is more than just one of conquest. It is the story of transformation. He took a scattered group of clans and turned them into a nation. He forged new methods of governance, new identities, and new ways of thinking about power and loyalty. He showed that African political and military structures were not static relics of the past, but dynamic systems capable of innovation, resilience, and expansion. In the broader context of the Mfecane, Shaka was both a product of chaos and a creator of it. He capitalized on existing tensions, but also amplified them. He was shaped by violence, and he reshaped the region through violence. Whether seen as a hero, a tyrant, or something in between, Shaka remains a towering figure, one whose revolution did not end with his death, but rippled across a continent.
The storm that Shaka unleashed did not remain contained within the Zulu heartland. His rise and the ruthless campaigns that accompanied it set off a chain reaction across southern Africa. Displaced warriors, refugees, rival chiefs, and entire communities found themselves on the move, seeking refuge, survival, or new beginnings. What began as a regional power shift quickly transformed into a continental reshuffling. But these migrants were not simply fleeing. Many became conquerors themselves, establishing powerful kingdoms in new territories and extending the military and political blueprint pioneered by Shaka. This was the second wave of the Mfecane, a time when the displaced reshaped the lands they entered. Among the most prominent of these wandering warlords was Mzilikazi, a former general under Shaka. Mzilikazi was not just any subordinate. He was one of Shaka's most trusted lieutenants, a brilliant military strategist in his own right. But like many powerful men under absolute rulers, he eventually fell out of favor. Whether it was a personal dispute, a perceived betrayal, or the simple threat of his growing popularity, Mzilikazi found himself at odds with the Zulu king. Choosing rebellion over submission, he fled with a band of loyal followers, beginning a long and arduous journey that would take him through Swaziland, Botswana, and ultimately into present-day Zimbabwe. But Mzilikazi's journey was no peaceful migration. Along the way, he raided, fought, and absorbed the groups he encountered, turning his followers into a multi-ethnic military state. He employed the same regimental structure and close combat tactics that had made the Zulu so formidable.
By the time he settled in the southwestern plateau of Zimbabwe, his followers, now known as the Ndebele or Matabele, had become a dominant force. In this new homeland, Mzilikazi established a kingdom based on military hierarchy, tribute collection, and centralized authority. The Ndebele kingdom would endure long after his death and play a significant role in resisting European incursions later in the 19th century. While Mzilikazi's story was one of conquest and expansion, another figure emerged with a different approach, Moshoeshoe II, the founder of the Basotho nation. Born into the Bakotili clan of the southern Soto, Moshoeshoe came to age during the chaos of the Mfecane. But unlike many of his contemporaries who chose war as their solution, Moshoeshoe embraced diplomacy, strategic alliances, and defensive fortification. Recognizing that brute force alone could not guarantee survival in such volatile times, he sought higher ground, literally and politically. Around 1824, Moshoeshoe led his people to the mountain fortress of Thaba-Bosiu, a flat-topped hill in present-day Lesotho. From this naturally defensible position, he welcomed refugees from across the region, displaced Ngoni, Tswana, Soto, and others who had been uprooted by the wars. Instead of subjugating them, Moshoeshoe offered security and belonging, weaving them into a unified Basotho identity. His genius lay in turning diversity into strength. Moshoeshoe was not naive. He maintained a capable military and defended his kingdom with skill, but his true strength was in negotiation. He navigated the threats of encroaching Boer settlers from the Cape Colony and played European missionaries and traders off one another to his advantage. His leadership style was deeply rooted in African traditions of consensus and respect, but he also adapted to changing times with remarkable agility. Under his guidance, the Basotho survived where many others were destroyed, and the nation he founded eventually evolved into modern-day Lesotho, one of the few African kingdoms to retain its integrity through colonial conquest. Further north, the upheavals continued. Zwangendaba, another commander, once linked to Shaka's military system, embarked on one of the longest migrations in African history. Leading a group that would become known as the Ngoni, he journeyed thousands of kilometers from what is now KwaZulu-Natal through Mozambique and into Malawi, Zambia, and southern Tanzania. His migration, often compared to a rolling thunderstorm, spread Ngoni military customs deep into the heart of Central Africa. As Zwangendaba's followers moved, they encountered Bantu-speaking agricultural societies. Sometimes they clashed violently, other times they assimilated. The Ngoni introduced age-grade military organization, military discipline, and Ngoni language elements to the regions they passed through. They left behind more than footprints. They left behind a cultural imprint that would shape the identity of numerous ethnic groups in Central and East Africa. Zwangendaba himself was remembered as a semi-mythical figure, both feared and revered for leading his people through immense trials and forging new communities from the ashes of dislocation. While some, like Moshoeshoe, chose diplomacy, and others, like Zwangendaba, marched into uncharted territory, Soshangane carved his empire along the southeastern coast. Also a former Zulu general, Soshangane was initially sent by Shaka to punish rebellious groups in Mozambique. But instead of returning, he stayed, seeing an opportunity to build his own dominion in a land rich with resources and relatively less centralized resistance. Soshangane's conquests led to the birth of the Gaza Empire, a powerful multi-ethnic kingdom stretching from the Limpopo River to central Mozambique.
He incorporated local Tsonga, Sena, and Shona peoples into his administration and military, using Ngoni customs as the foundation. Like Mzilikazi, he imposed Zulu-style regimental systems, initiated forced relocations, and demanded tribute from conquered communities. But he also adapted to the local environment, intermarried with indigenous elites, and blended cultural practices to secure his rule. The Gaza Empire became a major player in the regional power structure, interacting with Portuguese traders, Arab merchants, and later resisting European colonial efforts. Under Soshangane and his successors, the Gaza maintained a formidable military presence well into the late 19th century. Even after his death, the legacy of Ngoni militarism remained embedded in the region, reshaping how power and identity were understood along the eastern seaboard. These leaders, Mzilikazi, Moshoeshoe, Zwangendaba, and Soshangane, were not mere refugees. They were state builders, military innovators, and cultural architects. They carried with them the seeds of Shaka's revolution, but planted them in different soils. In doing so, they transformed the map of southern and central Africa. Each new kingdom that rose carried echoes of the Zulu state, but adapted its blueprint to fit local needs and contexts. The domino effect of the Mfecane was both devastating and creative. Entire societies were destroyed, but new ones emerged in their place. The migrations were brutal, but they also sparked cultural exchange, political innovation, and ethnic fusion. Groups that had never interacted before found themselves living side by side, sometimes at war, sometimes in cooperation. This fluidity gave birth to new identities, new languages, and hybrid traditions that still shape the region today. Yet, we must also acknowledge the immense human cost of this transformation. Villages were razed, women and children were enslaved, the elderly and infirm were left behind. Famine, disease, and trauma followed these migrations like shadows. The wars shattered social fabrics and memory lines, with oral traditions often breaking under the strain of displacement. For every kingdom that rose, countless communities were uprooted. Still, in the ashes of war, something resilient took root. The leaders who emerged from this period demonstrated that African agency was not destroyed by crisis, it was forged in it. They showed that African societies were capable of strategic reinvention, not just survival. Whether through the spear or the word, through conquest or coalition, these figures navigated a fractured world and reassembled it on their own terms. In many ways, the domino effect of the Mfecane illustrates a deeper truth. History is not only written by the victors, it is built by the displaced. The new power centers born in the wake of Zulu expansion were not just offshoots of Shaka's ambition, they were testimonies to African resilience, innovation, and leadership under fire. And as we move further into this story, we begin to see that the Mfecane was not just a period of destruction, it was also a period of reinvention and rebirth, played out on one of the most dramatic stages.
The Mfecane was not merely a period of political reshuffling and the rise of powerful kingdoms. Beneath the movements of kings and warriors, ordinary lives were upended in devastating ways. For countless people across southern Africa, these decades were marked by loss of home, of life, of language, and of legacy. The scale of violence during the Mfecane is staggering. Entire villages vanished almost overnight, razed by raiding parties or scattered by fear. Massacres were common, particularly in contested zones where rival groups clashed over territory or resources. While exact figures are difficult to confirm, historians estimate that hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, were displaced. Thousands more perished through direct conflict, starvation, or disease. As armies marched and borders shifted, civilians bore the brunt of the suffering. One of the haunting aspects of the Mfecane was the way displacement fractured entire societies. Families were separated, clans dissolved under pressure. Those who once cultivated the land were forced into a nomadic existence, moving from one place to another in search of safety or sustenance. Starvation swept through regions where fields were abandoned or burned, and traditional agricultural cycles were disrupted. With no time to plant or harvest, and with cattle either stolen or slaughtered, hunger became a weapon and a wound. Disease followed closely. In the wake of war and famine, weakened immune systems and overburdened refugee settlements created ideal conditions for outbreaks. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses spread rapidly, claiming even more lives. Medical knowledge was minimal, and the social safety nets provided by extended families or community elders were often missing or overwhelmed. The chaos of the Mfecane turned much of southern Africa into a continent-sized humanitarian crisis. Beyond the visible scars, burnt homes, mass graves, and wandering orphans, was the cultural loss. Many smaller clans and ethnic groups simply disappeared. Their languages faded. Their oral traditions stopped being passed down. Songs, stories, and ancestral knowledge that had been preserved for generations were lost in a single generation of upheaval. Elders who carried the memory of a people often died in isolation, with no one left to inherit their wisdom. For African historians and descendants, this represents one of the greatest tragedies of the Mfecane, not just who was lost, but what. Yet amid the darkness, there were also responses of resilience. Some communities adapted by retreating into mountain strongholds, Lesotho's Thaba Bosui being one of the most famous. There, natural geography offered protection where weapons could not. Others built fortified villages, using stone walls or defensive ditches to guard against raiders. Some adopted elements of the Ngoni military system to defend themselves, forming regiments or warrior councils to maintain internal discipline and external deterrence. New political identities also emerged from the ashes. The trauma of displacement forced many groups to redefine themselves, not just in terms of territory, but in shared experience. Refugees from different ethnic backgrounds often united under charismatic leaders who promised safety and food. These hybrid communities would go on to form the foundations of new nations, such as the Basotho under Moshoeshoe or the Ngoni under Zwangendaba. Instead of being erased by history, they rewrote it. Allies were forged where enemies once stood. Old rivalries sometimes gave way to pragmatic cooperation, especially in regions where mutual survival depended on it. In some cases, former enemies became integrated into a single polity, absorbed either through diplomacy or necessity. This complex web of destruction and reconstruction created a patchwork of identities, cultures, and languages that continue to shape southern Africa today. The human cost of the Mfecane cannot be reduced to statistics. It was not just the death toll, the migration routes, or the fall of kingdoms. It was the silent weeping of mothers burying children, the confusion of young boys forced into warriorhood, the prayers whispered in burning kraals, and the dreams abandoned on the long road north. For many, it was a time when God seemed absent and the earth itself turned against them. But it was also a time of endurance, a time when humanity bent under pressure but did not break. It was the seedbed of new nations, new visions, and new stories. The very fact that names like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique carry traces of this painful era is testament to the spirit of survival that outlasted the storm. In the next section, we'll explore how this tumultuous era became fertile ground for colonial opportunism and how the scars of the Mfecane were manipulated for imperial gain.
As the dust of the Mfecane settled, it didn't bring peace, it brought Europeans. By the early 1800s, southern Africa was no longer just a battleground for African kingdoms, it had become a chessboard for European powers. The British had seized control of the Cape Colony from the Dutch at the turn of the century, and their presence was steadily expanding. Alongside them were the Boers, Dutch-descended settlers who were growing restless under British rule. In the 1830s, many Boers packed their wagons and began the Great Trek, an inland migration seeking independence, farmland, and ultimately dominance. This expansion would bring them face to face with the very world shaped by the Mfecane. The Boers entered regions that had been destabilized, depopulated, or recently conquered. They encountered the aftermath of the wars, scattered refugee communities, new kingdoms like the Zulu, Sotho, and Ndebele, and contested territories still reeling from bloodshed. From their perspective, they weren't invading, they were discovering. The devastation they witnessed became a justification. Land that was empty or abandoned, they reasoned, must be free for the taking. The British, too, were watching with concern. The chaos in the interior posed a threat to their control of the Cape. Frontier wars with the Xhosa had already cost lives and disrupted trade. The expansion of militarized African states like the Zulu and Ndebele seemed to threaten the fragile order the British were trying to impose. Missionaries and traders moved inland, ostensibly to civilize and Christianize, but often functioning as spies, cultural disruptors, and agents of soft power. They brought with them not only the Bible and European goods, but also European assumptions about savagery, superiority, and civilization. And this is where the myth begins. The Mfecane, as a term and as a historical narrative, was not originally African. It was a concept developed largely through European eyes, especially colonial historians, missionaries, and settlers trying to make sense of the ruins they encountered, and, in many cases, to excuse their own ambitions. They painted a picture of southern Africa torn apart by black-on-black violence, a story of Zulu barbarism, endless tribal warfare, and shattered societies. It was a version of history that conveniently explained why Europeans were needed and why they had the right to rule. According to this colonial framing, the interior of southern Africa was practically empty. The wars had supposedly killed or displaced so many people that vast stretches of land were uninhabited. This empty land myth became a cornerstone of Boer land claims and British territorial expansion. After all, how can one steal land if no one lives on it? The narrative of widespread indigenous warfare allowed colonial powers to position themselves as peacekeepers, bringing order to a self-destructive continent. But this version of events is now widely challenged, and for good reason. In the late 20th century, historians like Julian Cobbing began to question everything about the traditional narrative of the Mfecane. Cobbing argued that the widespread devastation in southern Africa was not purely the result of internal African dynamics, but was deeply influenced by European actions, especially the destabilizing effects of the Portuguese and Arab slave trades in the east and the demand for labor and ivory in the south. According to Cobbing, the so-called Zulu-led chaos was in part a response to external pressure. Slave traders working from Delagoa Bay and beyond were capturing and trafficking people into brutal labor systems, many of them enabled or tolerated by European merchants. These disruptions, he argued, forced African communities to militarize, consolidate, or flee, accelerating the pattern of conflict and migration. The Mfecane, then, was not a uniquely African implosion, but a continental crisis fueled by foreign greed and colonial manipulation. Other scholars expanded on this, pointing to how missionaries and colonial administrators later helped exaggerate Zulu aggression.
Figures like Shaka were portrayed not as nation builders or political innovators, but as savage tyrants obsessed with bloodshed. This image served colonial interests perfectly. If Shaka and his heirs were the source of violence, then any European intervention could be framed as salvation. The African was the problem, the European the solution. But history is not that simple, nor is it that one-sided. Yes, Shaka and others used violence to expand and consolidate power. Yes, there were devastating wars and forced migrations. But they existed in a world that was already under pressure, from changing trade routes, foreign weapons, slavery, and the ripple effects of global empire. The Mfecane was not a vacuum. It was a storm stirred by many winds, some of them African, but many blowing from across the sea. And yet, for generations, school children across South Africa were taught the colonial version of history. Maps in Boer and British classrooms depicted vast, empty plains waiting to be developed. Textbooks explained African conflict without once mentioning European slave traders or the pressures of colonial trade. The myth became the foundation of policy, used to justify dispossession, conquest, and even later apartheid. In this way, the Mfecane became more than a historical moment. It became a weapon of narrative, a tool for empire, a justification for theft. But today, historians and African voices are pushing back. They're rewriting the record, not to deny the pain or violence of the period, but to reclaim it from distortion. The Zulu weren't monsters. The Sotho were not helpless. The migrations were not random. These were people responding to impossible choices in a world turned upside down by greed, power, and survival. The legacy of these myths still lingers. You see it in land disputes, in political rhetoric, and in how history is remembered or erased. But every time the truth is told, every time a name is restored, a lie is exposed, or a myth is shattered, Africa reclaims part of itself. The story of the Mfecane is not just about kingdoms lost. It's about memory, about whose version of history gets told. And in the next section, we explore the modern legacy of this history, the cultural, political, and spiritual echoes that still shape lives today.
The aftermath of the Mfecane was not merely a trail of destruction, but a complex tapestry of political, cultural, and psychological legacies that still ripple through southern Africa today. At its heart, the Mfecane reshaped the region's political landscape. What had previously been a mosaic of smaller chiefdoms and loose clan federations gave way to formidable centralized kingdoms. New nations such as the Zulu, Ndebele, Basotho, Gaza, and Ngoni were forged not just through bloodshed, but through bold leadership, strategic innovation, and the sheer will to survive. These new polities carried with them robust military systems, codified leadership hierarchies, and distinctive identities that still influence governance structures in places like Lesotho, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. The Zulu kingdom, under Shaka, became not only a military juggernaut, but also a blueprint for future statecraft. His regimented system of age-based cohorts, Amabuto, became a model replicated and adapted by other emerging kingdoms. Mzilikazi's Ndebele carried these ideas northward, incorporating local groups and developing a dual social structure of ruling Zulu elites and incorporated Shona or other local peoples. Similarly, Moshoeshoe Lesotho kingdom became a shining example of diplomacy and cohesion in a time of chaos. His legacy foundational to modern Lesotho. These were not temporary alliances. They seeded long-standing nations whose identities were forged during the fires of upheaval. Alongside political restructuring came profound cultural blending. The waves of migration and conquest did not simply obliterate older traditions, they also created new hybrid cultures.
As displaced groups moved across borders and settled in foreign lands, they carried their languages, songs, dances, and oral histories with them. In places like Malawi, Zambia, and Tanzania, Ngoni descendants still retain elements of their southern roots: military regalia, clan systems, and some Zulu-derived words, fused with local Bantu traditions. The result was not cultural erasure, but cultural fusion, a mix of Nguni, Soto-Tswana, and other indigenous customs that led to unique regional identities. Yet, the scars of the Mfecane remain deep. The violence and displacement disrupted generational knowledge transfer, severed ancestral land connections, and embedded a lingering trauma within communities. Many modern political boundaries were drawn, both formally and informally, based on the power shifts that occurred during the Mfecane. As a result, questions of land ownership, ethnic hierarchy, and historical grievance continue to surface in modern South African politics. In South Africa, debates around Zulu nationalism and the role of traditional leadership often harken back to Shaka's legacy. In Zimbabwe, Ndebele-Shona relations have occasionally flared into political tension, partially rooted in the historical migrations of Mzilikazi's people. The Mfecane is not merely a historical episode, it is a living memory that shapes political consciousness and identity in tangible ways. Moreover, the era laid the groundwork for later colonial encounters. The fortified states and heightened militarization created by the Mfecane would later resist or negotiate with European powers in complex ways. For example, Cetshwayo, Shaka's descendant, famously led the Zulu army against British forces at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, a military engagement that stunned the colonial world. Moshoeshoe, on the other hand, used his kingdom's mountain fortress to diplomatically engage with both Boer and British settlers, ultimately securing a level of autonomy for Lesotho that persists to this day. These interactions were influenced by the survival instincts honed during the Mfecane, where leaders learned to read the winds of power and adapt swiftly. Crucially, the legacy of the Mfecane is also tied to the modern struggle for historical narrative. In post-colonial scholarship, the period has been revisited, not only to understand African resilience and adaptation, but also to contest the colonial myths that obscured the truth. By recentering African agency, historians have highlighted the innovations, state-building, and leadership genius that arose from this period, rather than simply mourning its devastations. This shift in perspective offers young Africans today a fuller, more empowering view of their past. In the end, the Mfecane was not just a period of loss, it was a crucible of transformation. New nations emerged, old ones adapted or were absorbed. Cultures collided, merged, and evolved. And from the ashes of conflict, South Africa was remade, its political structures reinforced, its cultural fabric rewoven, and its memory forever altered. To understand the Mfecane is to understand not only the past, but also the complex identities and power dynamics that continue to shape the region's present.
The story of the Mfecane is one that defies simplicity. For too long, it has been reduced in many historical accounts to a narrative of destruction, of warlords, bloodshed, and wandering refugees. But when we look closer, with eyes attuned to the rhythms of African history and the resilience of its people, we see something more. We see not just conflict, but creation, not merely collapse, but consolidation. The Mfecane was, at its core, a period of profound transformation, violent, yes, but also visionary. Between 1815 and 1840, the social and political terrain of southern Africa was turned on its head. Entire communities were uprooted, but from that displacement came new nations. Empires fell, but new systems of governance rose in their place. Some more centralized, more efficient, and more unifying than what had come before. Cultures collided, yet many found ways to integrate, preserve, and adapt. In that sense, the Mfecane was both a tearing down and a rebuilding of Southern Africa's internal order. largely outside the influence of European colonialism, at least for a time. But it would be careless to romanticize this era. For every kingdom built, another was burned. For every leader remembered, countless ordinary lives were lost and generations scattered. Oral histories from survivors, passed down through families, speak not only of bravery and cunning, but of starvation, fear, and exile. The trauma of the Mfecane lingers in the silences of unmarked graves, in the stories that were never told, and in the identities that were fragmented across borders. If history often remembers the victors, Shaka, Mzilikazi, Moshoeshoe, who remembers the villages that vanished or the languages that faded? And so we must ask, was the Mfecane a tragedy, a rebirth, or both? The answer perhaps lies not in choosing one over the other, but in holding both truths in tension. Like many pivotal epochs, the Mfecane exposes the complexity of African agency. It was shaped by indigenous ambition, survival, and power, just as much as by the external pressures creeping in from colonial frontiers. It teaches us that African history was not passive, not a blank canvas awaiting European conquest, but a dynamic, self-determined saga full of triumphs and trials. As we reflect on this chapter of history, we're also challenged to think more broadly. Who gets to tell our stories? Whose voices are preserved and whose are silenced? Are we still viewing African history through lenses shaped by colonial interpretations, or are we bold enough to reclaim it on our own terms? The Mfecane offers us not just lessons from the past, but responsibilities in the present, to honor the forgotten, to celebrate resilience, and to retell the narrative with truth and depth. Because in the end, the Mfecane is not just about what happened in the 1800s, it's about how we remember, how we rebuild, and how, in the face of chaos, African societies again and again find ways to rise, not in spite of adversity, but sometimes because of it.